Earlier this year, you probably saw news stories about museums across the countries covering up their Native American exhibits. If you're a horror fan, you likely also saw last year's prequel to Pet Sematary. In other words, Native American graves are back in the cultural zeitgeist, but most people are unaware of the historical and current issues surrounding them. This is Real Representation, and today we'll be covering the history and future of Native American graves in media. Before we get started, it's important to note that there are over 500 different federally recognized tribes. This means there are a variety of burial practices and beliefs about the dead within Native American culture. Because of this, we're going to focus less on specific burial practices and more on how media represents Native American graves and the effects that have on public policy and public perception. Now, if you've seen any horror movies from the late 70s through to the early 90s, you're probably already pretty familiar with the Indian burial ground trope. If not, basically it's this kind of cliche at this point, where kind of late in the film, often after just talking with a wise old Indian, they discovered that why all the haunting or the, going crazy or the murders, why it all happened is because the setting of the book or movie or TV show is a Indian burial ground.
When was the Overlook built?
Construction started in 1907. It was finished in 1909. The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
This was most famously kind of popularized by Stephen King in two of his works, Pet Sematary.
Whose burial ground? Mi'kmaq Indians.
Probably the most famous version of this. And The Shining, where Kubrick, for the movie, really amped up this kind of idea of the hotel being built upon a Native American grave. I think for Stephen King, he was coming from a good place. He was very influenced by the American Indian movement. And I would say for him, I think he thought this will, encourage people not to mess with Native American graves. That bad stuff happens when you mess with Native American graves. And, kind of a general idea of, grappling with America's colonial past. I don't think he went around about it the best, but I think he came from a good place. Unfortunately, I think for a lot of other writers, it just became a kind of one-size-fits-all slap on the end of your movie where you can't figure out why this stuff's happening. When you don't want to build your own lore, it's a lot easier to just say, "Oh, it's a Indian burial ground," especially because, public people know that now. And so if you just say, "Oh, this was built on a Indian burial ground," people instantly get the connection. Oh, that's why it's haunted. This is bad for a few reasons. Probably one of the biggest ones, and we'll discuss this more in the next section, is that it really amps up the mysticism of Native Americans. Yes, there are white ghosts and ghouls in movies, but, rarely is the reason of the haunting that specifically, this idea that it's built on a gravesite. But for Native Americans, it's really amping up. And as we'll see, the more we kind of connect Native Americans with this mysticism, it kind of creates a way for people to get in there and make issues of Native American graves this idea of its science versus religion. And we'll get more to that. Another really big problem is that it often puts Native Americans in this position of being this thing of the past. Already, most people have very little interaction with current Native Americans. And so I think a lot of people, don't, when they picture a Native American, they're picturing someone from the 1800s. And so when the kind of primary way they're shown in movies is as ghosts, it really strengthens that idea, and I think it's definitely contributed to people thinking about Native Americans in that way. Which kind of brings me to my third thing, which it kind of firmly places Native Americans as the villains. Even if there's this idea of, well, they shouldn't, the white people shouldn't have built there, the stories were always following a white family or, some white protagonist who goes somewhere and all this bad stuff is happening to them. And almost always it's not like their fault. They didn't build there. They just happen to be there. And there's just this kind of blind rage by these native ghosts that just, they're gonna just punish whatever white person shows up. And as you can probably imagine, that's not a great message to be sending. And, it just strengthens the savage stereotypes. I think when we kind of have modern ideas of culture war and stuff like that, where, I think a lot of right-wing people especially have kind of gotten the idea of, like, minorities having a victim mentality where they just want to be angry and they can't let go of the past. And so when we have stories where Native American ghosts are just blindly angry at whatever white person stumbles upon, even though they're family or kid or, they're totally innocent, they're just so angry that they're gonna kill them. And once again, I don't think that the writers for most of these, I think maybe the Amityville horror writer, not so great of a guy, but everyone else, I don't think this was their intent. I think it's this problem of not realizing that by mysticizing, by making Native Americans a spirit, by making them this, otherworldly thing, that they are really dehumanizing them. And whether they intend it or not, that shapes the way people think about Native Americans. And as you'll see, that has really bad effects on public policy. Another problem with the Indian burial ground trope is that it's really trivialized Native American graves. As you can see in this clip from The Simpsons.
It's an ancient Indian burial ground.
Man, this place has got everything.
An ancient Indian what? Mr. Plute, Homer Simpson here. When you sold me this house, you forgot to mention one little thing. You didn't tell me it was built on an Indian burial ground! No, you didn't! Well, that's not my recollection. Yeah, well, all right, goodbye. He says he mentioned it 5 or 6 times.
It's the joke, that, he told him a bunch of times, and, I'm not saying The Simpsons can't joke about, it's clearly a pop culture reference, but because it's seen as this pop culture thing, Native American graves aren't real, they're just a trope in horror movies, that, you can just joke about how ridiculous it is. You see the same way that in the Onion clip.
A bipartisan congressional report released this week finds that almost all problems facing the United States are caused by the nation having been built on top of ancient Indian burial grounds. Jason, what's your take on this report?
It makes a lot of sense. Native Americans covered this country's land from coast to coast for centuries. Their bodies are buried everywhere beneath
That's
us.
right.
It's
The Treasury,
controversial.
the Pentagon, Congress, every single foreclosed home, they're all built on grave sites and therefore are cursed.
No, that's why the economy is struggling. It's not about speculative bubbles and lax regulation. It's Indian ghosts.
It's certainly...
Native American graves are used as this ridiculous thing to believe in. The idea that this is what's cursing stuff is ridiculous. And I think, the underlying joke the Onion's trying to make is very good and very funny. But the idea, the fact that they can even make that joke, that, the U.S. economy is, bad, is cursed because the U.S. is built on a Native American gravesite, everyone instantly thinks, oh, that's a ridiculous thing to say. The idea that it would be cursed because of that, which, America is built upon Native American graves and the blood of Native Americans, the idea that that would be something that's still affecting America today is something to joke about. And I think that's very telling. So the peak of the Indian burial ground trope is obviously in the late 70s, early 80s. But something kind of interesting happens at the end of the 80s, which is in 1990, NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is passed into law. Which, for those who don't know, this basically means that any institution, whether that be a university or historical society or museum that has received federal funding, has to repatriate, i.e. return to the tribe of origin, any Native American remains is the big one, obviously, but then also any artifacts. This is where we see earlier this year where they kind of cracked down a little bit on a section of NAGPRA which was like culturally unidentifiable objects. They kind of cracked down on that, and all of a sudden all these museums who were displaying these artifacts found in grave sites were having to take them down. But when NAGPRA was instated, interestingly, kind of the biggest argument against it was that this was putting science against religion. Now, this is notable because white graves have always been protected. And in fact, the first kind of laws that protected Native American graves, such as in Minnesota, simply worked by expanding that law to include all graves, and so no scientist ever claimed that, why are there laws against grave robbing? That's putting science against religion. But with Native Americans, they did make that argument. And, I'm not necessarily saying that it's a direct cause, but it's very interesting that we have all these movies of the 80s which are making this big point about how Native American graves are inherently religious, they're inherently mystical, that ghosts will haunt you for being near them, and all this bad stuff will happen, and that's the problem with building on them. Not that you're just, disrespecting Native American graves, not that you're destroying ancestors, but that there is this mystical element to them. And personally, I believe that lended very strongly to the arguments against NAGPRA. And that happened in 1990. And then in 1996, in Kennewick in Oregon, two hikers found some bones that ended up being a 9,000-year-old Native American skeleton. Now, this was a huge deal. This was, the oldest skeleton we had found in America, and there became a debate of, well, does this fall under NAGPRA? Now, the federal government certainly thought so, and the Engineers Corps, they took the bones and were planning on repatriating them. But they were sued by primarily anthropologists. And in these court cases, anthropologists made the argument that, hey, we should be allowed to research them. One, they made the argument that this probably isn't Native Americans. Maybe this is, some other group that has come that, actually came from Europe or something. But the more public-facing argument was that, once again, why are we pitting science versus religion? This is so old, it's, no current Native American is really related to these bones in a, oh, that's my grandma kind of sense. So why are we letting their religious beliefs about the dead stop scientific advancement? And this is seen in news coverage at the time. So all this news coverage constantly used, these kind of battle terminology.
So for the past 10 years, the First Nations Development Institute, has been doing against research
the religious beliefs of Native Americans,
non-Native
American
science
and
understand and
being
think
unbiased,
Americans,
that they're fighting against
two really
mysticism,
concerning
religion,
numbers that they found out,
which is
once again
about
I think this really ties back to
of Americans'
general cultural views,
they
but
know
especially the way it was
little
presented
to nothing
in the
about
media.
it.
Yeah, what are the actual
That their beliefs aren't about wanting their ancestors to be allowed to stay in the ground, but it's that they have these spiritual beliefs. Now, I will say, I think it is getting better. Looking at these more recent news stories, it's obvious that news media these days has kind of gotten the hint that we should be talking about this as a human rights issue. A lot of the slants these days in coverage is very critical of institutions that are holding on to it, because they're breaking the law. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we less and less see, stuff like the Indian burial grounds trope being used, in a lot of shows and movies these days, although there are still movies like Antlers that came out in 2021, which is about the Wendigo. But overall, we're more and more seeing Native American characters being seen as humans. We're getting entire shows like Reservoir Dogs where they're just people. It's not all about their ghosts and all this. And I think that has helped the way that the general public sees Native Americans. But we're not all the way there yet. So for about the last 10 years, the First Nations Development Institute has been doing research to try and answer the question of what do non-Native Americans know and think about Native Americans. And there's, kind of a lot of takeaways that they've found, three of which that are particularly concerning to me, that 78% of Americans say that they know little or nothing about Native Americans. And a reason this may be is that they found that 87% of schools don't teach about Native Americans past the year 1900. So, similar to what I talked about earlier, where in these films, almost all Native American representation is as ghosts, is as the dead. And that just plays into that. And that's expanded even more by the other finding, which is that less than 0.4% of representation in TV and film is Native Americans. And so for most people, the only time they're seeing Native Americans on their screens is as ghosts. And the reality is that severely affects the way that people see Native Americans, and that the way people see Native Americans severely impacts policy, which severely impacts the real lives of Native Americans, because they aren't ghosts. And so, it's easy to say, well, it's just a movie, who cares, people don't think it's real, but they do make real movies. There's a reason why advertisers pay millions of dollars to put their hamburger in the movie, because they know that people subconsciously go, oh, I saw that hamburger in that movie, and then buy that hamburger. And so for when all our movies are representing Native Americans as dead and mystical, or just there to either help the white main character or punish the white main character for something they didn't do, that's how regular people start to see Native Americans. And luckily now states are starting to require more teachings about Native Americans in school. Minnesota was actually the first state to do that. Now I believe there's about 8 states where it is required that every school teach about Native American history. But we still have a long way to go. And it's really hard to change institutions.
Hey, Future Jay here. I just wanted to jump in real quick and mention another reason why knowledge about Native Americans is so limited is that out of the 2,637 four-year colleges in the United States, only 53 have any sort of major in American Indian Studies, which is like 2%. And a lot of those 53 don't even have a dedicated major. It's just like a concentration within another major. Um, and so beyond, what I talk about in a second here a lot, like the media and getting more Indigenous voices in there, we need to provide more opportunities for Indigenous voices to have a place in academia.
But art can change a lot quicker. And so I think the more that we get Native American storytellers and directors and actors and writers into major productions and on the big screen, the more people will start to realize that they are regular humans and that they deserve the same rights and, respect for their dead as anyone else. So I hope that this video has taught you a little something that you didn't know, or at least allowed you to maybe think about, something that's so everywhere, you don't even realize that when Native Americans are in films, it's their graves and their ghosts. So next time you're watching, you can realize that and understand, how the way people are represented or not represented in film and television has a direct impact in those people's real lives. Thank you so much for watching this video. Subscribe. This is my first video, but I'll hopefully be making a lot more, talking about different groups of people and their representation, as well as different concepts and fields of study. So subscribe, hit that bell, and you'll get notified when I make my next upload. Thank you so much. Bye.